December 15, 1944. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside Camp Huntsville, Texas, and Greta Schneider pressed her face against the canvas covering, trying to catch a glimpse of what awaited them. For 3 days, she and 40 other German women had traveled across America in sealed railway cars and military vehicles existing on stale bread and water. They were prisoners of war, captured during the final desperate months of Germany's retreat through France. Greta had expected many things when they finally reached their destination. She expected barbed wire and guard towers, cold barracks, and colder stairs. She expected the Americans to treat them exactly as she had been taught. They would treat brutal, efficient, without mercy. What she did not expect was the smell. As the canvas flap opened and winter sunlight streamed into the truck, something else entered with it. A scent so rich and complex it made Greta's stomach clench painfully. Beef. Slow-cooked, beef with vegetables, herbs she couldn't quite identify, and something else. Something that smelled like comfort, like safety, like the kitchen of her childhood home in Munich before the war consumed everything. Captain Helen Morrison stood at attention as the German women climbed down from the truck, their gray auxiliary uniforms wrinkled and stained from travel. She watched their faces change as that impossible smell reached them, one by one. Some tried to hide their reaction, maintaining the rigid military bearing they had been trained to show. Others, like the young blonde girl, who couldn't be more than 19, looked as if they might weep. Greta's boots hit the Texas dirt, and she straightened her spine, determined to show no weakness before the enemy. But her traitorous stomach growled loud enough that the American guard nearest to her, a young private with kind eyes and a nameplate reading Martinez, smiled slightly. Not mockingly, Greta noticed with confusion. Almost sympathetically. Beside her, Liesl Hoffman swayed on her feet, and Greta reached out instinctively to steady her friend. Liesl had been a nurse before her capture, tending wounded soldiers in a field hospital until American forces overran their position. Now she looked like she needed a nurse herself, pale and trembling as the smell of that impossible stew surrounded them. The wind shifted, carrying the scent even stronger, and Greta heard several of the women behind her make small, involuntary sounds of hunger. When had any of them last eaten real meat? Months, certainly. Perhaps longer. In Germany, even before her deployment to France, beef had become a distant memory. The rations had grown smaller, the quality worse, until they were eating things that barely deserved to be called food, and they were the soldiers, supposedly the priority. She tried not to think about what her mother and sister were eating in bombed-out Munich. Captain Morrison began speaking in English, her words, translated by Corporal Chen, explaining camp rules and expectations. But Greta barely heard them. All she could think about was that smell, and what it meant that their captors were cooking something that smelled like home. The mess hall was nothing like Greta had imagined. Clean wooden tables arranged in neat rows, windows that actually let in sunlight, and at the far end, a serving line where steam rose from enormous pots. Sergeant James Walsh stood behind the counter, a large man with graying hair and an apron stained from years of cooking. He watched the German women file in with an expression Greta couldn't quite read. Not hatred, as she expected. Something closer to concern. Captain Morrison gestured for them to form a line. The women moved mechanically, their military training overriding exhaustion and confusion. Greta found herself near the front, directly behind Liesl, who clutched the edges of her uniform jacket as if trying to hold herself together. The smell was overwhelming now, impossible to ignore. Rich beef broth, carrots, potatoes, onions, and herbs that made Greta's mouth water, despite every instinct telling her not to show weakness. Sergeant Walsh began serving, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he ladled generous portions into metal bowls. Greta watched the woman ahead of her receive a serving that would have fed her entire family for 2 days back in Munich. Fresh bread appeared next to each bowl, actual white bread with butter. Real butter, not the ersatz substitute they had been eating for years. When Greta reached the counter, Sergeant Walsh looked directly at her. She met his gaze, expecting contempt or triumph. Instead, he simply nodded and filled her bowl until it nearly overflowed. "Eat up," he said in English, the words meaningless to her ears but the tone unmistakable. He wasn't mocking her. He was feeding her. Greta carried her bowl to the nearest table and sat with mechanical precision. Around her, the other women did the same. 40 German prisoners arranged in perfect rows, staring at American beef stew as if it might explode. The silence stretched uncomfortably. They had been taught that accepting kindness from the enemy was weakness, that Americans would use any advantage to break their spirit. But the steam rising from the bowls carried memories of mothers and grandmothers, of Sunday dinners and Christmas feasts, of a time before war made everything gray and cold and hungry. Marguerite Fisher, an older woman who had served as a communications officer, was the first to break. She picked up her spoon with shaking hands and brought it to her lips. Greta watched her face transform, eyes closing, shoulders sagging as if someone had cut the strings holding her upright. Marguerite took another spoonful, then another, and suddenly she was eating with abandon, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The dam broke. Around the room, German women began to eat. Some slowly, savoring every bite as if it might be their last. Others quickly, desperately, as if afraid someone would take it away. Greta lifted her own spoon, the metal cold and solid in her hand. The first taste hit her tongue, and she understood why Marguerite was crying. It wasn't just food. It was dignity. It was humanity. It was everything the propaganda had told them Americans would never give them. Greta chewed slowly, trying to make sense of what was happening inside her mouth and inside her mind. The beef was tender, falling apart at the slightest pressure. The carrots still had texture, the potatoes were perfectly cooked, and the broth carried flavors she had almost forgotten existed. Salt. Real salt, not the bitter substitutes they had been using. Pepper. Thyme, perhaps, or some other herb her mother would have known by name, but it was more than the taste. It was the care embedded in every element. Someone had taken time to prepare this meal properly. Someone had chosen quality ingredients and cooked them with attention and skill. Someone had made this stew for them, for German prisoners, for enemies. The cognitive dissonance was so severe, it made her head ache. She had spent 2 years being told that Americans were barbaric, that they had no culture, no refinement, no humanity, that they would treat captured Germans worse than animals. Yet here she sat, eating the best meal she had experienced since 1942, served by the very people who were supposed to be monsters. Across the table, Liesel had stopped eating and was crying silently, tears dripping into her bowl. Greta reached across and touched her friend's hand. "What's wrong?" she whispered in German. Liesel looked up, her young face crumpled with emotion. "My mother used to make something like this," she said quietly. "Before the war, before everything. And these people, these Americans we're supposed to hate, they're feeding us the way my mother would have fed guests at our table." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. How can they be the enemy if they cook like this? It was the question Greta had been trying not to ask herself. She glanced toward the serving line where Sergeant Walsh was refilling bowls for women brave enough to approach for seconds. He wasn't acting like a man serving defeated enemies. He was acting like a man who understood that feeding people properly mattered, that meals held meaning beyond mere nutrition. Private Martinez stood nearby, watching the German women eat with an expression of quiet satisfaction. When he caught Greta looking at him, he didn't glare or smirk. He simply nodded, as if to say, "Yes, this is how it should be." Greta forced herself to take another bite, then another. With each spoonful, carefully constructed beliefs began to crack. She remembered the speeches, the newsreels, the endless propaganda about American cruelty and German superiority. She remembered being told that Americans had no respect for culture or tradition, that they were interested only in destruction and domination. But this stew told a different story. This stew spoke of tradition, of recipes passed down through generations, of the belief that even prisoners deserved to eat food prepared with dignity. She finished her bowl and sat staring at the empty metal, her mind churning. Around her, the mess hall had filled with quiet conversation as women began to process what had just happened. Some still looked suspicious, convinced this was some elaborate psychological trick. Others, like Marguerite, seemed to have accepted the impossible truth that their captors might actually be kind. Greta set down her spoon with careful precision. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. The beef stew became a Thursday tradition, though Greta didn't learn this until the third week of December, when it appeared again. Between servings, the camp settled into routines that continued to contradict everything she expected from captivity. The barracks were heated, not luxuriously, but adequately. The blankets were wool, actually thick enough to provide warmth during cold Texas nights. The guards maintained professional distance but without cruelty, without the casual violence she had witnessed from some German officers toward their own troops. Private Martinez seemed to take special interest in the German women's welfare. He walked the compound during evening hours, checking that windows were properly sealed against drafts, that the heating stoves had sufficient coal. Greta watched him carefully, trying to understand his motivation. Was this strategy, some sophisticated American technique for breaking their resistance? But week after week, his kindness remained consistent and apparently genuine. He brought extra blankets when Katrin Weber caught a cold. He helped Helga Braun repair a broken bed frame without being asked. He smiled at them as if they were simply people, not enemies. On the fourth Thursday, as the familiar smell of beef stew filled the compound, Sergeant Walsh did something unexpected. He emerged from the kitchen carrying not just the usual pots of stew, but also a basket of something that made several women gasp audibly: tortillas. Fresh, warm tortillas that Martinez's grandmother had apparently taught Walsh to make specifically for this meal. The sergeant explained through Corporal Chen's translation that his cook had asked about the recipe, wanting to give the German women something special for the holidays approaching. Greta accepted her portion mechanically, but her hands trembled as she carried the bowl to her table. Martinez's grandmother, an old woman in Texas who had never met them, who had no reason to care whether German prisoners ate well or poorly, had sent her family recipe to be made for them. The tortilla was soft and slightly sweet, perfect for soaking up the rich broth. Greta tore a piece and brought it to her mouth, and suddenly she was crying like Liesel had cried that first day. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that strangers on the other side of the world were showing her more compassion than her own government had shown its citizens in years. Lieutenant Sarah Bradford, the camp's medical officer, began visiting the barracks regularly, checking on the women's health with thoroughness that surprised Greta. She brought vitamins, treated minor ailments, and spoke to them through translators with genuine concern. When Marguerite developed a persistent cough, Bradford personally ensured she received proper medicine and extra rations to support her recovery. The lieutenant even brought books in German from the local library, understanding that minds needed nourishment as much as bodies. Christmas approached, and Captain Morrison announced they would be permitted to create decorations from available materials. More than that, local families had donated small gifts, simple things like hand-knit scarves and mittens, bars of real soap, writing paper. Greta held a bar of lavender soap given by someone named Eleanor Walsh, Sergeant Walsh's mother presumably, and tried to comprehend why an American woman would spend money on gifts for German prisoners. The card attached read simply, "Stay warm this winter, God bless." That night, Greta lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling while snow fell softly outside. She thought about the stew, the tortillas, the soap, the blankets. She thought about Private Martinez checking window seals and Sergeant Walsh serving seconds without judgment. January brought mail call, the first since their capture. Greta stood in line with her heart pounding, hoping desperately for word from Munich. When Corporal Chen called her name and handed her a thin envelope covered in stamps and censor marks, her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it. The letter was from her sister Clara, written in November but delayed by the chaos of war. Greta carried it to her bunk and sat down, afraid to open it yet unable to wait any longer. The words inside shattered what remained of her illusions about home. Clara wrote in short, desperate sentences. Their apartment building had been bombed in October. Mother was alive but living in the basement with 6 other families, sleeping on concrete floors with minimal heat. Food rations had been cut again. The official allocation was now barely enough to survive, and even that often failed to arrive. People were eating tulip bulbs, boiling leather shoes for broth, fighting over scraps in the streets. But it was Clara's description of the children that broke something inside Greta. Skeleton thin, she wrote, with eyes too large for their faces. They don't play anymore. They just sit and stare, too weak from hunger to move. Greta read the letter 3 times, each reading making her feel more sick. Her family was starving in Germany while she ate beef stew in Texas. Her mother slept on cold concrete while Greta had a heated barrack and wool blankets. The guilt was crushing, but underneath it lurked something even more disturbing: anger. Her government had done this. Not the Americans who were bombing German cities, but the leaders who had started this war, who had promised glory and delivered only destruction. The leaders who apparently cared so little for their own people that prisoners in enemy camps were better fed than civilians at home. That evening at dinner, Greta could barely touch her food. Sergeant Walsh noticed and approached her table, concern evident in his weathered face. He said something in English, gesturing at her full bowl. Corporal Chen translated, "He wants to know if you're feeling ill, if the food isn't right." Greta looked up at this American sergeant who had spent weeks ensuring they ate well, who had learned to make tortillas for foreign prisoners, who treated them with more care than her own officers had shown. "Tell him," she said slowly, "that the food is perfect. Tell him my family in Germany is starving while I eat like this. Tell him I don't understand anything anymore." Chen translated, and Walsh's expression softened. He said something else, his voice gentle. Chen turned to Greta. "He says he's sorry about your family. He says no one should have to choose between eating and feeling guilty. He says maybe someday this war will end and people everywhere can eat properly again." Walsh reached into his pocket and pulled out a paper bag. Inside were hard candies, the kind that kept well for shipping. He pressed it into Greta's hands and spoke again. "For your next letter home," Chen translated. Not much, but something. February brought American newspapers to the camp library, and with them, photographs that would haunt Greta for the rest of her life. She had been practicing her English with Corporal Chen, enough now to read simple articles without translation. But the words accompanying these particular photographs needed no translation. The images spoke a language of horror that transcended vocabulary. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Names that meant nothing to her, attached to photographs that meant everything. Greta stood frozen in the library, the newspaper shaking in her hands. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, living people who looked like corpses, their eyes hollow and accusing. Guard towers and barbed wire and ovens built for purposes her mind refused to accept. The caption said these were concentration camps, liberation photos, evidence of systematic extermination, evidence of things done in Germany's name, with German efficiency, by German hands. Her stomach lurched violently, and she barely made it to the waste bin before vomiting. The beef stew from lunch came up, and with it, something else. Everything she had believed about her country, about her service, about who she was. Liesel found her there, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the newspaper. "Tell me these are propaganda," Greta whispered in German. "Tell me the Americans made this up to justify what they've done to us." But Liesel had been reading the medical reports, working with Lieutenant Bradford to improve her English. She shook her head slowly, her young face aged by comprehension. "The details are too specific, the medical documentation too precise. Greta, I think this is real. I think we served a country that did these things. More women gathered around the newspapers, their reactions ranging from denial to horror to rage. Marguerite Fisher sat down heavily, her face gray. "I have a cousin who disappeared in 1942, she said quietly. "The Gestapo came for him. We were told not to ask questions. I didn't ask questions." Helga Braun, who had maintained defiant pride in Germany throughout their captivity, stood staring at a photograph of children behind barbed wire. She made a sound like an animal in pain and walked out of the library without speaking. Katrin Weber began praying in a whisper, the same words over and over, "Forgive us, God, forgive us." That night, no one touched their dinner. The camp staff noticed but said nothing, giving them space to process what they had learned. Greta lay in her bunk, unable to sleep, unable to stop seeing those photographs. She thought about the stew, the blankets, the small kindnesses from people who had every right to hate her. The Americans knew. They had seen these camps, had liberated these prisoners, had witnessed German atrocities firsthand, and still, Sergeant Walsh made sure they ate well. Still, Private Martinez brought extra blankets. Still, Captain Morrison treated them with dignity. Greta finally understood why. The Americans were showing them what humanity looked like because Germany had forgotten. March arrived with unexpected warmth and an announcement that changed everything. Captain Morrison informed them that for Easter Sunday, the camp would hold a shared meal where guards and prisoners would eat together at the same tables. Not separated by authority or nationality, but as people sharing a holiday. The idea terrified Greta. Sitting across from Americans, making conversation, pretending they were equals, when she now understood how deeply unequal they truly were. Her country had committed unspeakable crimes, while these people had responded with beef stew and blankets. Easter morning came with clear skies and the smell of something extraordinary cooking. Sergeant Walsh had outdone himself, preparing not just his usual American dishes, but attempting German recipes as well. There was roasted chicken, potato salad made the American way, and remarkably, something that resembled Stollen, the traditional German Easter bread. It wasn't perfect, the spices not quite right, but the effort behind it made Greta's throat tight with emotion. Captain Morrison directed the seating personally, ensuring Germans and Americans alternated around each table. Greta found herself between Private Martinez and a young guard named Private Lewis, whom she had never spoken to. Across from her sat Liesel and Corporal Chen. The first few minutes were excruciatingly awkward, everyone focusing intently on their plates. Then Martinez did something unexpected. He pulled out a small photograph and showed it to Greta, pointing and speaking slowly in English. "Mi abuela." My grandmother. The woman in the photograph was tiny, wrinkled, and smiling broadly. "She make the tortilla recipe for you." Greta studied the photograph, this woman who had thought about German prisoners enough to share her family's food. "Thank you," Greta managed in careful English. "Very good, very kind." Martinez beamed, then showed her more photographs. His parents, his younger sister, their small house in San Antonio. He spoke in simple English about his family, his life before the war, his grandmother's cooking that he missed desperately. Private Lewis joined in, pulling out his own photographs. A farm in Wisconsin, dairy cows, a dog named Buster. His English was simpler, more patient, and Greta found herself understanding more than she expected. She pointed to the dog and said, "I have dog. Before war. Munich. Named Fritz." The name made both Americans smile, and somehow that small moment of shared humor about a dog's name broke something open. Around the table, conversations began to flow. Liesel was speaking with Corporal Chen about nursing, comparing techniques and experiences. Other tables showed similar scenes of cautious connection. Sergeant Walsh moved through the room refilling plates, his satisfaction evident. When he reached Greta's table, he said something that Chen translated from across the way. "Food tastes better when shared with friends." Greta looked around the table at these Americans who could have been cruel, who had every right to be cruel, who instead had chosen kindness. She thought about the photograph of Martinez's grandmother and realized something profound. These were not her enemies anymore. She wasn't sure what they were, but not enemies. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over, and with it came the question every prisoner had been dreading. What happens now? Captain Morrison called a general assembly in the mess hall, her expression revealing nothing as the 40 German women filed in and took their seats. The American staff stood along the walls, faces equally unreadable. Greta sat between Liesel and Marguerite, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the captain begin to speak. "Ladies," Morrison said, waiting for Corporal Chen to translate. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. As prisoners of war, you have rights under the Geneva Convention, including the right to repatriation to your home country. The United States government will arrange transportation back to Germany within the next 6 to 8 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps and released to return to your families." She paused, letting the words settle. Around the room, women reacted differently. Some looked relieved, eager to finally go home after months of uncertainty. Others, like Helga Braun, who had grown increasingly quiet since reading about the concentration camps, looked terrified. Katrin Weber began crying softly. Greta felt nothing. Numbness spread through her chest like ice. Return to what? Her mother and sister were living in a basement, starving. Her city was rubble. Her country had committed atrocities that would stain German identity for generations. She would return as a failed soldier who had been captured and corrupted by enemy kindness, forever marked by her time in American captivity. Captain Morrison continued speaking, but Greta barely heard until Liesel grabbed her arm sharply. "Listen," her friend hissed. "She's saying something else." Morrison's next words were spoken carefully, as if she had debated whether to say them at all. "I am also authorized to inform you that if any of you wish to explore alternative arrangements, the International Red Cross and Displaced Persons Services may be able to assist. This is highly irregular, and I cannot promise any particular outcome. But if circumstances make immediate repatriation difficult or dangerous for you personally, there may be other options." The translation hung in the air like smoke. Other options. Greta's mind raced. Did that mean what she thought it meant? Could they choose not to go back? Marguerite stood slowly, her voice shaking as she spoke in German. "Captain, may I ask for clarification? Are you saying we could request to delay our return? Or to go somewhere other than Germany?" Chen translated, and Morrison nodded carefully. "I'm saying that if your personal circumstances warrant consideration of alternatives, we have channels to explore that. Nothing is guaranteed. But you have the right to make your situation known." The room erupted in whispered German conversations. Greta turned to Liesel, whose face reflected the same desperate hope and terror she felt. "My entire family is dead," Liesel whispered. "I confirmed it last month through the Red Cross. Everyone. What do I return to? An empty house in a destroyed city where everyone will hate me for being captured. My mother and sister are alive," Greta said slowly but barely, "and they're suffering because of what Germany did, what we were part of, even if we didn't know." 3 days after the announcement, Greta stood outside Captain Morrison's office with 11 other women. They had spent 72 hours in agonized discussion, weighing duty against survival, loyalty against reality, the past against an uncertain future. Now they were about to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Liesel stood beside her, pale but resolute. Marguerite was there, along with Katrin, and surprisingly, Helga Braun, whose defiant pride had crumbled completely after learning what Germany had done. Captain Morrison invited them in, her office suddenly crowded with nervous German women. She studied their faces with an expression Greta had learned to recognize as compassionate professionalism. "You've come to a decision," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Greta had been elected spokesperson, her English now good enough for this impossible conversation. "Captain Morrison, We request to remain in United States, not as prisoners, as displaced persons. We ask for chance to build new life here." Her voice shook, but held steady. "We understand this is unusual. We understand you may say no. But we cannot return to Germany. Not now. Maybe not ever." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me why," she said finally. "I need to understand what you're really asking for." So Greta told her. She spoke about families destroyed or starving, about cities reduced to rubble, about the shame of discovering what their country had done while they served it in ignorance. She spoke about the kindness they had received here, the dignity they had been shown by people who had every reason to hate them. She spoke about Sergeant Walsh's stew and Private Martinez's grandmother's tortillas and the Easter meal where they had shared tables with former enemies who had become something else. Something better. "Here," Greta said, searching for words in her second language to express what her heart needed to say, "here we learn what it means to be treated like human beings. Even as prisoners, even as enemies, you give us food with care, blankets for cold, medicine when sick, respect we do not deserve. In Germany, we go back to hatred. People hate us for losing, for being captured, for failing the Reich, and we hate ourselves for serving country that did terrible things." She paused, gathering courage. "But here, maybe we can be different people. Maybe we can learn to be the kind of people who deserve the kindness you showed us." Liesel stepped forward, her young face earnest. "I have no family to return to, Captain. Everyone is dead. If I go back to Berlin, I will be alone in ruins, hated for wearing this uniform, hated for surviving when others did not. Here, Lieutenant Bradford says, I could finish nursing training, I could help people, I could do something good with my life, instead of just surviving in rubble." Morrison looked at each woman in turn. "You understand this won't be easy? You'll need sponsors, employment, housing. You'll face suspicion and hostility from Americans who lost family members fighting Germany. You'll be starting completely over with nothing but the clothes you're wearing." "We understand," Marguerite said quietly, "but we already have nothing. At least here, we have hope." 20 years later, 1965, Greta Walsh stood in the kitchen of her small restaurant in Houston, stirring an enormous pot of beef stew. The recipe was Sergeant James Walsh's original, but she had added her own touches over the years. A hint of paprika her mother used to favor. Carrots cut, the way Clara had taught her as a child. Bay leaves from Eleanor Walsh's garden, a connection between her old world and her new one. The result was something neither purely American nor purely German, but somehow both. Something that tasted like home, whatever that meant now. Through the kitchen window, she could see the dining room filling with the lunch crowd. Her nephew Daniel, Private Martinez's grandson actually, though she considered him family nonetheless, was seating customers with easy confidence. The restaurant sign read, "Greta's Table," in both English and German script. A deliberate statement that some boundaries could be crossed, some divisions healed. She had married Thomas Walsh, the sergeant's nephew, in 1948. A quiet ceremony with Liesel as her maid of honor, and Eleanor Walsh weeping happy tears. Thomas had never fought in the war, and perhaps that made it easier. He had no battlefield memories to overcome, only a German woman his uncle spoke highly of, who was trying desperately to build a new life. Liesel had finished her nursing degree and now worked at Houston General Hospital as head of pediatric nursing. She had never married, pouring her love instead into the children she cared for. They had lunch together every Thursday, the same day Sergeant Walsh had served them stew all those years ago. A small ritual of remembrance. Marguerite had moved to Dallas, running a successful bakery. Katrin taught German at a local high school. Helga worked with a refugee resettlement organization, helping other displaced persons navigate their own impossible transitions. Of the 12 who had chosen to stay, 11 had survived and built lives they could be proud of. But the choice to remain had come with costs Greta never discussed publicly. Letters from Clara had eventually stopped after Greta's decision became known. Her sister couldn't forgive what she saw as betrayal, choosing comfort with former enemies while family starved in occupied Germany. Their mother had died in 1949, and Greta had not been there. That guilt lived in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold, a weight she would carry forever. Yet standing in her kitchen, watching steam rise from the pot, Greta knew she had made the right choice. Not an easy choice, not a painless choice, but the right one. Captain Morrison had taught her that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing what to build with the future. Sergeant Walsh had shown her that feeding people with dignity mattered, that small acts of kindness could change lives. Private Martinez and his grandmother had demonstrated that humanity could transcend nationality. The lunch bell rang and Greta began ladling stew into bowls. Each portion generous, each bowl served with care. Her customers included veterans who had fought in Europe, young people who barely remembered the war, and other immigrants who understood what it meant to start over with nothing but hope. As she served, Greta thought about that first bowl of stew in December 1944, the meal that had cracked open everything she believed. Home wasn't Munich or Houston. Home was wherever people chose to feed each other with kindness, wherever former enemies could become family, wherever a simple bowl of beef stew could mean redemption.